What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you something a little bit different. So I was thinking up videos for today, and I was recently thinking about ARPGs in particular because I mentioned in a video a little while back that they're one of my favorite genres of games, despite me not covering them really, and this is because I primarily play ARPGs just to kind of chill out. But my point is, they were on my mind, and it reminded me of what was my own personal Cyberpunk 2077 moment, except 10 years ago now. And that is, of course, as the footage I'm sure told you, the launch of Diablo 3. Now, I do want to specify the launch, because actually, the expansion for Diablo 3, Reaper of Souls, as well as some of the subsequent updates to the game, I think actually helped it out quite a bit. These days, Diablo 3 is pretty solid, albeit some of the number bloat is ridiculous. But to give you the bigger picture and why this was such a disappointment to me personally, we've got to go backwards a little bit. To the 2000s. So if you followed the channel for a little while or you've watched a couple specific videos, you might have heard me talk about this in the past a little bit. But basically growing up, I was incredibly poor. So while I was in high school in the 2000s, there were times I was actually homeless, etc., and it was a pretty rough time. So as you might imagine, playing video games wasn't exactly something I got to do a lot of. But one game I could play pretty consistently was Diablo 2. I played it a lot in offline mode, as you might imagine, but every once in a while when we had internet, I would definitely play the latter. But it's really hard to understate how much I played Diablo 2. It was all the time. I would ballpark probably in the thousands of hours range, mostly because it was, like the only thing I could play in a lot of cases. And at the time, most any hardware would run it, so it wasn't really an issue. But as such, I developed a pretty deep love for the Diablo franchise, and I still appreciate the franchise to this day, albeit how it's been treated has been rather unfortunate. Because prior to Reaper of Souls redeeming Diablo 3 a little bit, Diablo 2, which released back in, I believe it was 2000, and Reaper of Souls launched in 2014, so there was an insane gap between decent Diablo content, and now, almost a decade later, we might eventually get Diablo 4. I mean, I'm pretty sure it's going to launch eventually. However, how good it is remains to be seen. But let's get back on point a little bit here. I really loved the Diablo franchise. It hadn't seen a release in forever, and that brings us to me just getting out of the army, finally on my feet for what is arguably the first time in my life. And right around the corner is the launch of Diablo 3, which is, at this time in my life, easily the most played game of mine. So naturally, I'm very excited for it. One could even say I was hyped, which is something I generally these days tend to caution people on. And of course, May 15th, 2012 rolls around, Diablo 3 releases, and it is underwhelming. Frankly, I would honestly not even go so far as to say it was bad. The real problem was that it was average. And following up an amazing title with an average title is just as bad as releasing a terrible one. But that said, I'm talking about the product overall. There are parts of Diablo 3 I think that were genuinely terrible, like the Real Money Auction House. For those of you that are uninitiated or simply don't remember, Diablo 3 launched with a Real Money Auction House. Similar to World of Warcraft's auction house, players could find and sell items for real money. They turned the game pay to win on purpose. Blizzard did this. I mean, Activision Blizzard did it, but you know what I'm saying. And to be honest with you, I would say the Real Money Auction House, more than just about any other factor, just destroyed Diablo 3. Combine that with some of the in-game systems being really lackluster, the fact that the best way to get gear was to literally just pay out of pocket for it, and it was an absolute mess of a launch. And while I'm not going to sit here and say that it decimated me emotionally or anything, because it didn't, it was just the most disappointed I have ever to this day been in a video game that I was excited for. And as silly as it sounds to say, this was actually a real watershed moment for me and gaming. This is basically the moment where I was like, the people making games are real people dealing with real technical limitations and real publishers forcing them to do things they don't want to do. Because unfortunately, that's the way a lot of that industry works. Now, while Diablo 3 eventually did see a lot of this stuff fixed, the Real Money Auction House removed, most of this was actually done with the expansion, Reaper of Souls, but at the end of the day, it was just simply too little too late. There was a second expansion that was ultimately canned, And nowadays we're looking forward to Diablo 4. So I could pretty easily wrap it up right here, but I'm going to give you guys just a bit more today, actually. Because this is a subject I am particularly passionate about and don't get a chance to talk about very often, there are parts of Diablo that I think were very well done. I think the first act was very strong. I think the Reaper of Souls act was very strong. However, I think that at the end of the day, Diablo 3 was fighting an uphill battle its entire life, basically. For starters, it had to follow Diablo 2, which is not an easy thing to do. But you combine that with some decisions that were just wrong out of the gate. For starters, the art style took a more whimsical approach. And while there are parts of Diablo 3 that are absolutely dark and gory, at the end of the day, it was just such a departure from the gothic grittiness of Diablo 2 that it's honestly off-putting in some ways. And then you combine that with the fact that even some of the skills were just more whimsical and fantastical in nature. And while yes, Diablo is a world of magic and fantasy, when you look at, for instance, again, Diablo 2, a lot of the magic and stuff is, again, much more gritty and elemental in a way. Whereas a lot of Diablo 3 was just like, look at the pretty lights. And it caused some real juxtaposition. And then, furthermore, Diablo 3 also had a lot of very ethereal high fantasy settings. For instance, Act 4 takes place in literally heaven, which isn't exactly traipsing through the harassed jungle of Diablo 2. Now, looking forward a little bit, I think Diablo 4 is closer to getting it right, but at the end of the day, there's just too much up in the air for me to speculate one way or the other. But I will say that I like the art style 10 times more than Diablo 3. Diablo 4 looks like it's trying to be a genuine successor to what made Diablo 2 successful, which I think is ultimately what made the Diablo franchise successful, and I'm really hoping they get it right. But that said, again, these days Diablo 3 is actually not that bad to play as far as ARPGs go. There you go, everyone, just a bunch of information on what was, for me, hands down my biggest disappointment in gaming. Rather than tell me about your own personal disappointments in the comments, I would actually rather you tell me about games you're hoping do better in the future. Because at the end of the day, we all make mistakes, everyone is going to have misfires sometimes, and ultimately all we can do is learn, try to grow and do better, and I would rather leave it on that positive note myself. So, there you go guys, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of it, truly, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.